don't know about you, but a lot of my life has been based on what I ought to do. I mean, think about it. How many oughts do you have in your life? I've grown up with lots of oughts. You know, good parents have good expectations that they put on their children to grow up and be good, right? Well, you ought to make good grades. You ought to behave. You ought to make good choices. You ought to go to a good college. You ought to do something with yourself. There are lots of oughts that govern our life, is there not? Like, you ought to hold down a good job, right? You ought to be able to pay your bills. You ought to be able to provide a life for yourself, for your family, for your children, whoever it may be. You ought to be an upstanding member of the community, right? We ought to do that. Voting day is coming up. Now, for those visiting, I'm not about to launch into a political talk. But we're told, are we not, that we ought to get out and vote? Those are good oughts, good things that we ought to do. There's a lot of oughts that are even secondary and maybe even subliminal, but they're no less present in our lives. Like, we ought to spend a good part of our life striving to make an impact on the world. We ought to strive for glory. Now, we want to pretend like we don't, like, oh, I'm so humble, I would never pursue glory on my own, but we do it whether we want to acknowledge it or not. Who among us has not wrestled, at least at some point, with the question, like, if something were to happen to me tomorrow, God forbid, who would remember me? What impact would I have left on this world? Well, if that question bothers you at all, you ought to be making some different choices in your life. You ought to be doing things differently. You ought to live in such a way that you can leave this sense of impact, glory even, behind. There are other oughts that we strive for. We ought to be financially well off. So we strive for money, right? We ought to be popular, have good favor, good influence with people. We're told somewhere along the way, you ought to strive for this kind of life. We ought to seek some sense of security for ourselves. We ought to do those things. Those are all good oughts. I mention all of that to say, I feel kind of sorry for James and John. You know, this is a text that probably too many sermons I've heard in my life kind of pick on James and John. They say, oh, James and John, you know, they must have taken their doofus pills this morning. You know, they haven't been listening to Jesus. This is the third time that Jesus tells them in Mark's gospel, look, guys, we're going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to die. Things are not going to end well, or they're not going to end the way you think they might end. This is the third time he's tried to tell them. And here comes James and John, just, you know, the disciples, right? Jesus, you say you're going to suffer. We want glory. We pick on them. I kind of feel bad for them. Because the truth is, I think we all want to be the kind of people of faith who say, you know, Jesus, I want to be good enough that I can sit at your right and your left hand if so chosen. Now, yeah, there was probably selfish motive behind what they had to say. I mean, they waited till the other 10 were over here and they're like, Jesus, come here. Let me whisper this so the other 10 don't hear. Forget them. Put us at your right and left hand. And then we can just launch into this tirade of picking on them for, you know, that kind of behavior. But who among us has not sought special favor? Has not said at some point in our life, we're exceptional. We're special. We stand apart because of how good we are. We pick on James and John, but the reality is this. Every one of us, at some point or another, has been James and John. We've all thought we were special. We've all said, you know, we're these people of virtue and integrity and faith, and people ought to think of us more highly than maybe they even do, because we're special. We work hard, don't we? We work hard to be virtuous people. We make good choices. We do the things we ought to do. That's what we say. In the life of faith, there's a lot of oughts, right? You ought to serve others. You ought to give generously. You ought to come to church on a somewhat regular basis. You ought. I thought about this all week long. It was a simple sermon maybe where I could just like set up James and John as the straw men and kind of just pick them apart and give you this wholesome word about, your own ambition. Don't let it get the best of you. Don't let all the personal selfishness and self-centeredness control you. I mean, and all that's true. But the reality is, I'm not so sure it's always a choice between the selfishness and the discipleship. Because if we're not careful, there's an element of selfishness that gets woven into our discipleship too. We ought to follow Jesus and help others, and then all of a sudden we look around and think we're better than those who don't. We ought to care about the poor, and then we turn our nose up at those who may question programs and motives and things that supposedly help the poor and may or may not always do so. We ought to love and serve others and accept all people, except what about those who don't always accept all people, and then we don't want to accept them in return? See, we ought to do these things, and even in our discipleship, the oughts don't always change the way we live. They don't always reveal the transformation that happens through Christ. This is why I'm convinced maybe it's not always a choice between the selfishness and the selflessness, but it's a choice between the ought and the want. W-A-N-T, in case my southern accent's a little thick. And you say, well, Ben, wait a minute. Those wants are what gets me in trouble. I want money. I want fame. I want popularity. I want, right? You sound like that 5-year-old child. I want every time you go through a store or whatever it is in life. True. Fair enough. But I'm not sure that I can cure or show you a different way around your wants by beating you over the head with a bunch of oughts. You ought to not be so selfish. You ought to be more giving. You ought to do whatever it is. You ought. There's a want that you have to have more because it's the wants that inspire you to change and be different. Henry Nouwen, this famous author, and maybe you've heard the story of his life, but Nouwen is a phenomenal person because right around the peak of Nouwen's fame as a theologian and writer and thinker, he walked away from a famous life in academia. He'd taught at Yale for years. He'd been a foreign missionary on the side and written all these amazing books, Wounded Healer, all these other things. Then he's at Harvard, the pinnacle of the theological world maybe for some. And he should have everything he ever wanted. And he's miserable. He's done everything he ought to do to get to where he is, and he's unfulfilled. And it's a chance meeting that Nouwen has with a man by the name of Jean Vanier, where he changes the course of his life. Jean Vanier is the founder of the L'Arche community. L'Arche communities are these amazing intentional communities where persons of all ranges of abilities live together in community, worshiping, sharing in discipleship. It's intentional community. And it's challenging. If you've ever been in an environment with people of all cognitive abilities, there's all kinds of things you have to be aware of. And it's not the easiest place always to live for those who may be privileged in physical abilities or privileged in cognitive abilities or whatever it is. But what Vanier showed Nouwen is there is something more to life than just what you pursue and achieve. There's a beauty that we all seek in each other, a community, love, grace in the face of the most unexpected people that we could ever encounter. And Nouwen left Harvard. And he became the theologian in residence, the chaplain of a L'Arche community outside of Toronto, and spent the rest of his life writing and doing that. His academic friends probably thought he was crazy. This is everything he ever wanted is right here, and you're unfulfilled? Yeah. Because at the end of the day, if we spend our lives doing nothing but everything we ought to do, our lives are amazingly unfulfilled. Because there's no passion. There's no want. And you say, well, I've got all these wants I want, but what if there's a greater want to inspire you to be more, to do more, to grow more? Maybe the way around those selfish wants is not for me to beat you over the head with all the oughts. And Jesus is trying to show James and John not what you ought to do, but look, y'all, you want glory, right hand, left hand, all this other business. Disciples are going to get mad because they wanted it too and you asked first. And he's telling them, no, you don't know it yet, but you're a part of a greater story. The Son of Man is going to go to Jerusalem and he is going to suffer and he's going to die, but he's going to be raised again. And the course of human history will forever be changed because of it. And you get to be a part of this. Jesus tries to tell them, there's something greater here that you should want than just your own selfish ambition. I want to highly recommend this book. It's about 25 years old. I'm rereading it. It's called The Ragamuffin Gospel by Brennan Manning. Brennan Manning's passed away now about 7-8 years ago. Manning's a complicated man. He went into the priesthood and then fell in love with a woman and left the priesthood and got married. His marriage fell apart. He's a lifelong alcoholic. Struggled with alcoholism. Wrote about it, very raw, open way of talking about his illness. Even to his very last book, where those of us, 20 years ago who read this and thought this was the greatest thing we'd ever read, his book that comes out after that, he talks about a relapse. Even as he was famous in the theological world, he relapsed and struggled. And maybe it's writing out of that brokenness that Brennan Manning has this amazing way of pointing us to the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That it's nothing about the oughts, but there's something more compelling than that. There's a quote that I've been chewing on for a couple weeks from here that I think is the essence of grace. Manning writes, because salvation is by grace through faith, I believe that among the countless number of people standing in front of the throne and in front of the Lamb, dressed in white robes and holding palms in their hands, that's Revelation 7, in case you're wondering. Manning says, I shall see the prostitute from the Kit Kat Ranch in Carson City, Nevada, who tearfully told me that she could find no other employment to support her 2-year-old son. I shall see the woman who had an abortion and is haunted by guilt and remorse, but did the best she could faced with the grueling alternatives. I shall see the businessman besieged with debt who sold his integrity in a series of desperate transactions. I shall see the insecure clergyman, clergywoman even, addicted to being liked, who never challenged their people from the pulpit and longed for unconditional love. I shall see the sexually abused teen molested by his father, who's now selling his body on the street, and who, as he falls asleep each night after his last trick, whispers the name of the unknown God he learned about in Sunday school once upon a time. But how, we ask? Then the voice says, they have washed their robes and have made them white in the blood of the Lamb. There they are. There we are. The multitude who so wanted to be faithful, who at times got defeated, soiled by life, and bested by trials, wearing the bloodied garments of life's tribulations, but through it all, clung to faith. Manning writes, my friends, if this is not good news to you, you have never understood the gospel of grace. I could give you a laundry list of 100 things you ought to do this week to be a faithful person, to be a good person, to live the way that Christ calls you to live. Lots of oughts. But not one of them, not one, is more compelling than the good news that your life is somehow mysteriously and beautifully woven up into this story of salvation. That no matter what that awful thing is that has happened in your life, at whatever point it may be, even right now, no matter what it is. That the good news of grace is that that word, whatever that word is not the final word on you. That God wants more with you, from you, for you. That there's no amount of work or selfish ambition or whatever we think we can put into this life to make us worthy of sitting on the right or on the left hand. God says, don't worry about all of that. You are broken. You are flawed. Got some messy ugliness in your life. But that's okay. Because God's love is stronger. Because you have an invitation to join your life in this story of grace and salvation that continues to unfold. And it's amazing. It's a story of hope and mercy and love. And we live in such a way in light of it, not because we ought to, even though there's a little ought, but more so because we want to. Because God's love is that real and that compelling and that lovely and beautiful. We live in the light of a want that comes as a gift because God first loved us. And the beauty of grace is that there's nothing we can do that we don't do out of response to this God who loves us and turns every expectation of what we ought to do upside down. Thanks be to God. Amen. Hey, thanks for watching the latest sermon here at Historic Trinity Church in Savannah, Georgia. I'm Reverend Ben Gostin. I'm the senior pastor here at Trinity Church. And I want to take this opportunity to invite you. If you're ever in Savannah, Georgia, we would love for you to visit us on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. We're located on Telfair Square, been here since 1848. Also, you can check out the comments below for a way to give if you feel so led. Again, you're welcome anytime here at Trinity Church.